Welcome back to History Chat at 1 o'clock on Thursdays. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. As I have said in the past, doing these last few years that we have all lived through, these last few decades we've all lived through, these are slightly different than I normally do when I talk history, because I have been editorializing. I try and identify when that happens. And today I'm going to be taking you into realms that are perhaps not normally talked about when we do political history, but they're very important now. So let me start, first of all, with where I hope I left things with Barack Obama. And that was the election of Obama in 2008 was a real problem for the movement conservatives who had taken over the Republican Party. Because if Bill Clinton was a problem for them with their belief that nobody reasonably could vote for a Democrat, and their belief that, in fact, people voting for Democrats must somehow be illegitimate voters, because who would vote for a Democrat? Then Barack Obama was a real problem, because Barack Obama personally embodied everything that Republicans or the movement conservatives who took over the Republicans in the 1990s had come to identify with anti-Americanness. That is, he's an African-American, biracial actually, but an African-American, which in their minds, of course, was associated since the 1870s with the redistribution of wealth. And I hope I've explained that enough. That's the idea that comes out of the Civil War, when you have both a newly active federal government put in place by the Republicans that also opens up the vote to men of color. By the 1870s, you get opponents of Black rights beginning to talk about opposing African-American participation in the political process on the grounds that African-Americans will, they say, vote for politicians who will give them stuff, stuff like hospitals and roads and schools. And those things can only be paid for with tax dollars. And since, by definition, after the Civil War, the people who owned property in the South were white, that in their minds made a redistribution of wealth from hardworking white people to, in their minds, lazy African Americans who wanted a handout. And that idea that somehow opening up the vote to include more people, especially people at the bottom of of society, is a form of communism, is in fact the idea that has taken over America since the 1870s periodically. And as I hope I really laid out in the Eisenhower years, the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 really makes that central to the language of the movement conservatives. In 1955, you get the establishment of National Review, William F. Buckley Jr.'s magazine, which insists that any kind of federal legislation that levels the playing field is, as he says, a form of socialism or communism. And this is where you get the wedding, if you will, of between the idea that anybody who believes that the government has a role to play in regulating the economy or providing a basic social safety net or promoting infrastructure, those are principles that are shared by Republicans and Democrats both, that anybody who supporting that kind of a government is part of the liberal consensus, and that they are somehow a part of an organized political coup, if you will, a cabal called the liberals, capital L liberals, to imply that they are organized rather than simply just a way of looking at the world. And you get this idea that somehow anybody who is a liberal is sort of a watered down communist, snaking communism into America. And of course, you see that nowadays, where anytime anybody makes any suggestion that the government does in fact have a role to play in something other than promoting the protection of property and big business and promoting Christianity, that they are somehow anti-American. They are this nasty liberal. Anyway, and I want to emphasize here, this is when people talk about communism in America, they are not talking about communism as it was established, world communism as it was established in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. That's really something entirely different. Same word, but it comes out of, the American version comes out of the moves toward socialism and communism of the 1840s, where people literally were trying to develop new kinds of communities, like the Oneida community in New York, like the Graham community which was designed to promote good nutrition, why we have graham crackers, for example. They were attempts to experiment with a different kind of social organization as we got the rise of industrialization and people weren't entirely sure this was a very good thing. All right, so if that's the case, when Barack Obama comes into the office of the presidency, he represents, for movement conservatives, all those fears that they had, the idea that he is a community organizer, that he is going to use the government to regulate business and promote a basic social safety net and level the playing field amongst Americans and promote infrastructure. All of those things are literally the image of socialism or communism as they have been portrayed in the American political arena since the 1950s. Again, harking back to the old language of the 1870s. So, which I talked about, if you care, I talked at great length about that when I did the 1870s. So when they look at Barack Obama, they literally see their fears come to life. And ironically, if you think about it, Barack Obama was also Lincoln's dream come to life. I mean, he is a man from poor circumstances who worked his way up, obviously a brilliant man, who was trying to do what was best for everybody in America. It was no accident that Barack Obama did pattern himself on Abraham Lincoln, and people made those comparisons. But the modern day Republican Party had turned against that because of the political rhetoric that had surrounded the government since the 1950s, and again, harking back to the Reconstruction era, and really coming to the fore after the presidency, or during the presidency of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. I don't know if you guys are okay. My screen has frozen. If that is the case, sorry about that. I've not done anything different here than normal, and my connection should be fine. There's nobody else on this connection. All right, so so where are we with Barack Obama? As you know, under the Obama presidency, the movement conservatives who controlled the Senate determined that he would accomplish nothing. That in fact, as I keep on saying, movement conservatism cannot compromise. It's not a question of somebody like Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell not being willing to. You cannot compromise if you believe in absolutism, if you believe in the ideology that the government getting involved in any kind of the liberal consensus will destroy America. It's not that you won't compromise, you can't compromise, because even the littlest step toward the Democrats and toward the idea of this activist government is itself a destruction of that government. So obviously the Republicans in the Senate set out to make sure that Barack Obama could not accomplish anything that he had promised to do, or to go ahead and to put into place his programs. And most dramatically, of course, you saw Mitch McConnell refusing to let Barack Obama put into place his federal judges and Supreme Court Justice Merrick Garland. It was not just Garland, it was also a number of other federal judges as well, which is why President Donald Trump had in his back pocket a backlog of federal appointments that he could make when he came into office. And he has, as you know, made judicial appointments at a cracking pace since he began. All right, so what happened with that? If you remember the election of 2016, what you had was Hillary Clinton, who had a long history of political activism in America, and who was herself an embodiment of the many things that movement conservatives had been against since, again, the Reagan era. The idea of a woman who wanted equality in American society, who was not sort of a wife or mother type. She was actually acting in the idea of women being able to take an equal position in America, and a woman who was very powerful. And she spoke to all of the anger that movement conservatives had built up really since the days of Janet Reno, if not before. The idea that somehow women having a role outside that of being wives and mothers or sex objects was itself an affront to the patriarchal system that established order in America, both at the family level, the governmental level, and for many people at the level of God, who in their minds ordered the world along the patriarchal lines that the family was supposed to mirror. So on the one hand, you had Hillary Clinton arguing for the inclusiveness of American society and carrying this enormous weight behind her. And on the other side, you had many Republican candidates for the presidency. And we're going to talk about Trump, but I want you all to, not to look backward, but rather to remember being there and to remember that the people who were vying for the nomination on the Republican side in 2016 were all extremists. And Donald Trump was actually the most moderate of all of them. And that, I know some of you just probably exploded, but that's the truth. Because if you remember, for all that he embraced the rhetoric of the Republican Party, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a second, he also called for fair taxes. He called for ending loopholes for business. He called for a better universal health care plan and insisted he had one, which, by the way, he's still insisting. We've never seen it. He spoke in a lot of ways about embrace. He was not an ideologue. He spoke of embracing some of the principles of liberalism that Americans like. He said he was going to protect Social Security. He said he was going to make things fair again. And the other Republicans who were on the debate stages with him, for example, were extremists. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that because of the rise of the right-wing echo chamber, especially the Fox News channel at the time, although now we have One American News as well, that it used to be that you had a political career in America, and after you retired, you became some kind of a pundit. You wrote a book and you went on speaking tours and you made money that way. But with the rise of Fox News and the entertainmentification, if you will, of right-wing politics, one of the ways that you can get yourself a good paying gig on the right-wing media is to run for office. And you see this again and again, where you have people who get a following because of their political prominence, because they are running for office, and then they drop out and they become contributors to the Fox News channel. And that is one of the reasons that you actually sort of had people trying out for TV on that Republican stage. But you also had them recognizing that because of the gerrymandering and because of the extremists on the right, that the only way you could get the nomination was to play to the people on the far right. The problem is you can't win a general election that way. But so you had one of the moments that to me really was transformative, and that was Carly Fiorina, who was running in 2016, actually standing on a national stage and saying that her opponents, Democrats, killed babies and sold their body parts. And that to me as a historian was a huge moment, because that is 1,000% the language of genocide. That when people start talking about their opponents in that way, the idea that they are attacking children and they are in some fashion butchering their children or acting or eating them, what's the word, acting as cannibals, that kind of that language where you say somebody is attacking children and butchering them or eating them or whatever, that's the language of genocide. That's precisely how leaders encourage their followers to commit genocide. And so to hear that coming out of Carly Fiorina on a national stage chilled me to the bone. And I wrote about it then, and then I wrote about it again later when Donald Trump Jr. began to talk about Democrats as insects, as vermin. Both of those things are huge red flags to anybody who has studied any kind of a genocide. And so a lot of us called attention to it and said, hold on here, folks. We're way, way, way outside of the normal range of political behavior in this 2016 election. And the person who was not, who was not that much of an extremist in the movement conservative mold was Donald Trump. So what does he do? Donald Trump is a fascinating character to me. Because he's not a politician. And listen to where I'm going with that. Donald Trump is a salesman. He's a narcissist. He mirrors back what people around him want to hear. So when and himself, as you know, as himself, he's actually really quite a simple man in that, and by the way, he's very good at what he does. You know, people always want to say he's stupid. He is not a stupid man. He's very good at what he does, which is to sell himself, to sell his brand. And I always said that he has no core. There is no core. He simply reflects what people around him want to see. And as a result, that made him an enormously interesting figure to me in 2016, because he was, in fact, mirroring the movement conservative language that had built up from the previous generation, from Reagan onward. But he didn't understand it was a veneer. He didn't understand. To him, it was the core of what the party was. And obviously, to his supporters, it was too. But he stripped the veneer off of what so many respectable Republicans had said was only people talking. And as he came down that staircase, the escalator, and started to talk when he announced his candidacy in 2016 about immigrants from Mexico as being rapists and criminals, what he was really doing was he was articulating what the movement conservatives and then the Republican Party had been saying since at least Ronald Reagan, in language that they had picked up from the movement conservatives since the 1950s, and language that, of course, reached all the way back to Reconstruction. The idea that America is a country that is supposed to be run by white men. And that idea that really the country runs best when you turn power over to what he called the best people. You turn the power of the country over to a few really terrific people who are educated and have money and have good connections and know how to run the world. That's a language that has always been with us in America, and that has always been sort of under the surface since the 1980s in the language of the Republican Party. But he took it and ran with it and revealed it for his supporters as what they always believed it was. You know, the people in charge who talked about it, who now have woken up and said, we just had no idea. That's always what it looked like to people on the ground. You know, they tied their racism and their sexism, which was encouraged by leadership, into their support for Donald Trump. And he, as I say, revealed that for what it was, not only in his comments about immigrants. And by the way, if you remember, I commented this whole way through on this. You know, when people picked that up and said, oh boy, we got a problem here, lots of people fought back against us and said, oh, he didn't mean it. Oh, you're misreading it. Oh, this is not really what he's going to do. Obviously, you know, we were right and they were wrong. And similarly, if you remember, on I think it was October 7th of 2016, when it was revealed he made the comments that he did about sexual assault, and the man has been credibly accused of sexual assault of more than a dozen women. I think it's more than 24, but I'm not going to go with that. I think it's at least more than 20, credibly. And people are looking the other way. Well, why? Why would they do that? They would do that because, again, if you have grown up with and embraced movement conservative ideology, the idea that women either belong in the home as wives and mothers or are available for sexual purposes, it's no problem if you have a wealthy white elite man who behaves that way. That's expected. Women who are available have made themselves available in that ideology, and it only makes logical sense. So it might be appalling to people like me, I won't speak for you, but ideologically, it absolutely fits. So if ideologically Donald Trump comes into office, and again, I maintain that if you dropped him in the middle of, Africa, he would be have a completely different set of policies, because he mirrors the people around him. But by dropping him here in America, after a generation or more of this political language and winning political language, into a party that since 2000 had managed to continue to stay in power, despite the fact it did not have a majority of the people to support it, by gerrymandering and by suppressing the vote and by coming up with different ways to skew the electorate, like the disinformation that had been put forward by Fox News, he became, in a way, the perfect embodiment of what it meant to be a movement conservative Republican in 2016. So he's a really fascinating character, and I think really shows the danger, as you know I study, of language and of creating an image with language that isn't true. And someone said when he was elected that it was rather as if your Fox News channel watching uncle had become president, because it seemed that he really did believe there was a replacement plan for the Affordable Care Act, when of course any observer knew there wasn't, that was just rhetoric. But he got into office and he's like, okay, let's put forward our plan, and there wasn't one. So what happened in 2016, I want to step back and talk a little bit about, because there's some ideas here I think most people aren't aware of. And first of all, I want to start with the idea that the ideology behind Donald Trump in 2016 is logically coherent. I do not adhere to it. I suspect if you're listening to me, you do not adhere to it either. But it is logically coherent. If you believe that the world works best when you keep a few wealthy white men in power because they're the ones who are smart, they're the ones who understand how to run the economy, then it only makes sense that you do not want to have people who disagree with that voting. You know, they shouldn't be voting because they're going to vote for policies that in your mind will hurt the ability of those elite men to run things. And they are going, therefore, to slow down or to actually work against America. They are, if you will, un-American. Now, excuse me, that's exactly the way we got to the 1898 coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, when in fact there was no doubt that which I talked about here before, if for those of you who don't remember it, it was a coup in North Carolina, in Wilmington, obviously, where a group of Republicans and alliance members, biracial coalition, had been legitimately elected, and nobody denied they were legitimately elected. But the white people in the city got together and said, we don't care that they were legitimately elected, that they had the most votes. They shouldn't have been electing. They shouldn't have been voting because they have voted for things that are dangerous for our society. They are going to redistribute wealth. They are going to destroy our town, and therefore we're going to run them out of town. And if you listen to the newspaper accounts from the people who were doing the running out of town, they insisted they were the best people in society, and that they had not had to do anything really to get the duly elected people out of office, because they knew they really weren't good enough to be in office. And they overlooked the fact that dozens of people were murdered in that coup, and it was really a coup. So that there is an internal logic to making sure that Democrats can't vote, because you've been hearing since 1980 that Democrats are dangerous. They're communists. They're going to vote to redistribute wealth. They're destroying the country. No, it's not real. I mean, this is why I study the crisis, the conflict between image and reality. It is not real, but it's powerful. So one of the things that happens in 2016 is, if you believe that, then isn't it sort of your duty to make sure that Donald Trump wins once he has gotten the nod, once he has gotten the nomination? And by the way, he gets the nomination because we talked, at least I've written about it, I'm not sure I've talked about it here, but in the 1970s, there's a big crisis, 1960s really, there's a big crisis in both parties, because the popular nomination for president is, people don't feel they're being represented in the nomination for president. And that's the point at which the Democratic National Committee goes ahead and throws the doors open and invites a lot more people in to have a say in who gets nominated for president. The Republicans do something similar, but they do it a little bit different. I would call it a little bit, it's under the table. What they do is they claim to be throwing open the doors for Republican voters to choose the presidential candidate. But what they do is they front load their primaries and their caucuses in low information states. And the idea behind that is that they figure that Republicans, then low information voters, will throw to the top whichever candidate has name recognition, which is why, of course, there was such a war chest for Jeb Bush in 2016. He was the one candidate out there who had big name recognition. But what they were not prepared for, of course, was somebody else who had better name recognition than Jeb Bush. And that, of course, was a reality TV star. So that's how he gets the nomination. And once he's gotten the nomination, there's something else in play. And this is an important piece, I think. So of course, about Citizens United and the idea that basically we're going to have unlimited money flowing into to the American system in 2016. And you may or may not have seen in the last week or so, I've lost track of time, there's been a dump of documents from what's known as FinCEN, the Treasury Department's agency that looks into possible financial crimes, and they flagged something like $1 trillion worth of money pouring into America in 2016, which is may or may not be illegal. Like I say, it was only flagged, but that was only 0.02% of all the claims in about a 10-year period that FinCEN had been hit with. So there's a lot of money running around, and there's a lot of money, as you know, probably from my stuff coming through the NRA, the National Rifle Association, which suddenly had tons of money to spend in that election, and it's unclear where that money came from. There's suggestions it came from Russian oligarchs. I've written about that before. But there's a lot of money coming into America. I want to emphasize it is illegal. It is illegal to take anything of value from a foreign government or individual to influence a U.S. election. Anything, information, anything, that is illegal. And yet, if you believe that the Democrats are un-American, shouldn't you look the other way in this this world where finances are all over the world and the money, trillions of dollars is going through everything all the time? Why should it matter if your money comes from a Russian oligarch who has dual citizenship, as both Democrats and Republicans took money from such a man? Why should it matter if he just hadn't bothered to get the American citizenship? Now, I'm not defending that. I believe it's illegal. The books say it's illegal. But I'm just saying, if you follow the logic here behind the people who are supporting Donald Trump, it makes logical sense. It's illegal, but it makes logical sense. So what happens in 2016? As you know, of course, Donald Trump loses the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, which is not small. It's more than 2%. That's a lot. Just so you know, that's a lot. How did that happen? So there's two things that are really interesting. There's a lot of things that are interesting about the 2016 election, but this is something that I would like people to understand, and that's Facebook, where we are right now, and social media, but especially Facebook. Because there's something about advertising that virtually no American understands, and it's a little bit complicated. So I'm going to walk you through it. But I want you to understand that when you see an ad on Facebook or on television or on the radio, which is where initially it was, this whole idea was, what I'm going to tell you about, was pioneered. The money is not in selling you that washer or dryer. That is not what is being sold. And hang on, because I know this is a hard concept. What is being sold is you. And let me explain how that works and where it comes from. It actually comes from the 1930s. I'm pretty sure it's the 1930s, when a guy was doing his psychology degree, his PhD, a guy named Frank Stanton. And he was really interested in how people were interacting with popular media, what was happening. So he got permission from people to go into their houses and to put boxes on their radios. I think it was all done on radio. It's going to go into TV, although it might have been in TV. I'm doing this off the top of my head now. And then ask them to keep a log of what they were listening to. And what he didn't tell them was that he said it was monitoring the electricity, but what it was really doing was monitoring what, in fact, they actually were looking at. And what he discovered was that they were saying that they were listening to educational programs and news, and they were way estimating how much time that machine was actually on. But he was able to compare that to what they really were doing, and they were listening to, fun programs and entertainment and all that. And what he realized was that you could look at what people are engaging with, and you could build demographic portraits of the people who were listening to certain shows without them knowing it. Now, Frank Stanton goes on to take this information to CBS, and he's going to be the guy who runs CBS for like an eternity. I mean, he's like the longest running head of CBS forever and a day. And this is the concept that is behind television advertising, first of all, that because you're looking at a huge group of people, what you can literally do if you watch your audience is you can say, I don't know if Heather Richardson's going to buy a washer or dryer, but I do know that she fits this demographic. And if I bundle this demographic, I can go to an advertiser and say, I don't know which one of these people is going to buy your washer and dryer, but I know that 70% of them are. So 70% of these people, or 90%, or 2%, are going to be open to your advertising. And that's what they are selling. They are not selling the product, they are selling you packaged. And I hope that makes sense to you, because this matters in 2016. Because of course, if you remember 2016 on Facebook, and by the way, it's happening again, what you saw again and again were all these stupid quizzes. What kind of dog are you? What kind of beetle are you? What kind of, what's your favorite? Pick one of these pictures. Which one do you like best? What we were doing was self-selecting into demographics so that we could be micro-targeted with advertising that was literally tailored to us. And that did not mean you got an ad saying vote for Donald Trump. It meant that if you, for example, had a history of, and I'm making this up because I was not on the other side, but if I had a history of waiting in long lines in the rain at a voting booth, I would be very susceptible to news articles, fake news articles, by the way, about people getting stuck in the rain at voting in voting, or stories about rain, because it would dampen, no pun intended, my enthusiasm for going out and voting. That micro-targeting, which by the way is going on again right now, was enormously effective in not simply in getting people out for Trump, although it certainly was. Stories, for example, about an undocumented immigrant who killed a child or something like that was micro-targeted. But similarly, people who otherwise would support Hillary Clinton, they would micro-target people with stories about her being ill. I mean, the very fact that somehow Donald Trump was the one who came out of that election looking healthy and Hillary Clinton was not, when the man can't walk, I'll just stop right there, says something about micro-targeting. And similarly, they really depressed the Black vote by emphasizing again and again policies in the past that might have looked bad to Black voters. So that's one of the things that goes on in the 2016 election. And that micro-targeting has been really clearly taken apart in a number of places, but there was a company called Cambridge Analytica, which was really responsible, run by the Mercers. It was really responsible for a lot of that micro-targeting. So we were it was really psychological warfare. And we now know, because of the Senate Intelligence Committee report, as well as the Mueller report, but the Senate Intelligence Committee report is the one that I like to point to because it was written by Republicans. Says that the Russian intelligence agencies were very much doing that in 2016 and are doing it again, which, by the way, is why I'm on Facebook, is because recognizing what had happened, I felt like I just had to get out there and put some skin in the game and help people recognize what actual truth was. So that's why I'm here. And, everyone keeps saying I need a column in the New York Times. I've written for the New York Times, and I someday will write for the New York Times again, but I'm here now because of American democracy. So that's one of the things that went on. And the other thing that went on was that that Donald Trump won by a very little bit in key states. And there are a number of things about that squeaky, narrow, thin victory in those states that is really problematic. And what I'm going to say now, I'm going to tell you exactly how much evidence in it has been proven, because it hasn't all been. But if you remember, in the last Senate Intelligence Committee Report, Volume 5, which I really urge everybody to read. You know, every time I write about it, there's always somebody who says, "Oh, it's all lies." You know, listen to the Republicans. I'm like, it is the Republicans. Go read the report. It actually has a, if you call it up, just Google it. If you call, it's a PDF. It's got the table of contents. Don't bother. It's quite long. And then it's got a summary. It's about a 3 or 4 page summary. It's very easy English. You can read what the Republicans who run the Senate Intelligence Committee, along with their Democratic colleagues, believe happened in 2016. And you know, somebody said, well, I just don't believe that the stuff I'm going to tell you is true. And I'm like, well, I don't know. They looked at 1 million documents and they interviewed more than 200 people, and they have top secret clearances. Their pay grade is a lot higher than mine. So if they say this happened, I'm good with it. All right. So here's what is established. What is established is that Paul Manafort, who was Trump's campaign manager, communicated throughout the campaign with his Ukrainian business partner, a man named Konstantin Kilimnik. Kilimnik, according to the Senate intelligence report, is a Russian operative. One of the things that Manafort did and admitted was that he gave polling data to Kilimnik. But because both Kilimnik and Manafort communicated on encrypted phones, we do not know what he did with that polling data. All right, I'm leaving that right there because that's all we know. The other thing we know is that after the election had apparently been called, the exit polls, which tend, by the way, to be very accurate, the exit polls had suggested a win for Hillary Clinton in those critical states. A newscaster, and now I can't remember which one, who was being considered for a job in the Trump White House, gave those results to a member of the Trump campaign. And he was reprimanded for doing that. They are not supposed to do that. And there that also stopped. Maybe it didn't matter, but that win was narrow enough that those two things, I think, are of interest. We also had the problem, of course, in 2016 in North Carolina and possibly other states. The voting machines went haywire and nobody knows why. And you can Google that if you're curious about that. All right, so that's 2016. So Trump, and if you look at Donald Trump, I never thought he actually wanted to win that election. I thought he was trying to start his own cable news show, and in fact, he did. Most people forget that there were a few episodes of the Trump TV show. I forget what it was called now, but he just looked to me like he wanted his own TV show. And the look on his face when he found out he had won, I think, is worth thinking about when people talk about whether or not he might be compromised. It is entirely likely, it seems to me, he didn't really intend to win that election. And of course, Michael Cohen said as much in his recent book that he did not intend to win. All right, so now we've got him in office. We've got this man in office. He does not have a transition team. I mean, that's the other thing about not wanting to be elected. He never put together a transition team. So usually when you're running for office, you early on start developing a transition team simply because there has to be a handoff, right? The Biden campaigns had one for 6 months because they want to hit the ground running. Trump had no one. He didn't have a transition team. So he's got to now figure out what he's doing. And when in office, he does, with the help of Steve Bannon, who had taken over for Andrew Breitbart at Breitbart and turned it into a much more extremist and really what's the word? And Breitbart was certainly a right-wing channel before that, but Bannon brought a level of disinformation and racism, really especially racism, but also sexism to Breitbart, and of real disinformation to that Andrew Breitbart had not. And so Bannon had been with Breitbart. And by the way, the guy who's now in charge of Voice of America is a Bannon guy. Anyway, so he brings into the White House, along with people like Stephen Miller, an attempt really to purge society and turn it into the kind of vision that movement conservatives always wanted. So what does that look like? As you remember, it started early on with the travel ban, which was pretty much an explicit attack on countries, on Muslim countries, which did not hold up in court entirely. And that started right away. That was actually in January, right after this is after Trump was elected. And a personal side here. Many of you actually may have already heard of me before you started following all this stuff, because I'm the person who wrote the shock event post way back then. Many of you don't make that connection, but that's when I probably came first across your screen, because it was clear to me that this presidency was about image and not reality. It was about the bringing to creating a reality, like the George W. Bush administration had told Ron Suskind back in 2004 they could make their own reality. So they were trying to put this um, um, this vision into play and make reality out of it. So we get the travel ban, and we increasingly get this idea that Donald Trump put together in his inaugural address, his vision of America as a land of carnage, which is really interesting because he talked, I mean, George W. Bush famously turned to Michelle Obama and said, well, and I quote, well, that was some weird shit, unquote. Because usually what a president does is they give a very upbeat inaugural, and sometimes they'll take some pot shots at their predecessors. Certainly Ronald Reagan did to Jimmy Carter. But generally you try and be upbeat and say, I'm going to represent everybody, and America is just going to have, milk and cookies from here on out. And instead, his vision was absolutely dystopian. And what's really interesting about that to me is that, of course, he's brought it to life. I mean, he inherited a presidency that had a country that had a growing economy, that certainly had plenty of problems, but we did not have fire we did not have these natural disasters all over. We did not have rioting in the streets on the part of militia people, by the way. We did not have a pandemic that is killing us at an ungodly rate. He really has brought that to reality, and I feel certain that there will be history books that talk about the Trump years as the years of American carnage, which sort of is lyrical, if you think about it, or Shakespearean perhaps is a better way to put it. Anyway, so what he does is he tries to put in place the vision that the movement conservatives have wanted all along. And mind you, he's done a bloody good job of it. So, for example, you may have forgotten this, but one of the first things that people complained about was he basically gutted the State Department. There were floors of the State Department where people said they just wandered around because there was nobody in them. And that was not because he wanted to replace them with his own people, although certainly he has done that as well, but because that whole idea of Americans engaging with the world is part of that liberal consensus, part of the idea that America has a role to play as a member of the world. And not simply a country throwing its weight around, but a country that is in fact trying to negotiate and to keep the playing field level with dictators and authoritarians around the world. We've walked away from that. We've entirely not entirely, but largely walked away from the that political role. He also has absolutely slashed regulation. I mean, slashed regulation to the point that it's beyond where many businesses want it, because they would like the stability of knowing what regulations are going to look like and being able to produce what buyers actually want. And that's been a real deliberate attempt to go ahead and not simply to open up business, although that's certainly what people argue he is doing. It is an attempt to get rid of the governmental role of regulating business, which is, of course, what the movement conservatives have wanted ever since Franklin Delano Roosevelt put in place the New Deal, and Eisenhower picked it up with his middle way in the 1950s. He certainly has gone ahead and slashed social welfare legislation, and as I've talked about before in the History and Politics chat, he's made it clear that what's on the table, if there is a second term, is getting rid of Social Security. And that, again, most people sit there and say, how could he do that? People love Social Security, and they do, and similarly Medicare. But again, logically, if you believe that the government has no role in regulation or a basic social safety net or infrastructure, of course you don't like Social Security. Of course you don't like Medicare. And that's been the position of people like the four guys, Rand, Paul, and Paul Ryan, all along, that the government has no role to play in those fields. We must get rid of things like Social Security, which are damaging America. They are hurting America. They actively believe. Now, people like me look at that and say, well, actually, we think it's a lovely thought that people in their older years don't have to eat out of garbage cans, but which is how we got Social Security in the first place. But they look at it and they say, no, what you're doing by having Social Security and Medicare and, SNAP benefits and all the and job programs is you are hurting the ability of people at the top to run their businesses as they see fit, and you are hurting their ability to accumulate the capital that is going to enable them to innovate and to create new jobs, the job creators, right? Now, that's of course not the way the economy actually works, but that's their argument for how it works. So it only makes sense. Then Trump, of course, has also tried desperately to privatize our infrastructure. And you see this really most dramatically in many, many places, but most dramatically with the United States Postal Service. And while we are focusing now on Louis DeJoy, who is the recent Postmaster General, the very recent Postmaster General who's been trying to stop mail-in ballots. In fact, as soon as he went into office, the Trump administration put forth a document proposing a number of changes in America, and top of the list was privatizing the United States Postal Service. And their argument for that is that it could be done more cheaply by private industry. But of course, observers look at that and recognize that the way that that would happen is what it would amount to is that the private postal carriers would in fact carry things more cheaply in the cities, but they would simply not carry at all to rural areas, or you would have to get, if you were in rural areas, it would take a great deal of money to get things out there. And what really is going on, people forget that the United States Postal Service has a number of extremely valuable patents. Not only in the sorting of mail, but also in the carrying of mail, because they actually have programs that show you where every single member of American society lives. That proprietary information is wildly valuable. And you may not remember this, but when Congress passed the first CARES Act, the Coronavirus Act, it put in it a $10 billion loan for the United States Postal Service in order to help it get over this terrible crisis of the coronavirus. But Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, a Republican appointee and a loyalist to Donald Trump, would not release that money to the United States Postal Service unless it handed over some of its proprietary information. So in order to, and the United States Postal Service Board, which is all made up of Trump appointees, agreed. So they handed over their proprietary information for their 10 top customers already to Louis DeJoy and presumably to the private companies in which he has more than $30 million invested. So you see here the privatization of our government, and you see the privatization of our infrastructure. And this is not a bug, it's a feature under the Trump administration, because again, this was the program all along since the 1950s. Get rid of that liberal consensus, get rid of the New Deal, get rid of Eisenhower's middle way, those things that regulate business and promote infrastructure and provide a basic social safety net, because by turning the government over to business, it will be more efficient, and people at the top will make a great deal of money, which way they in turn will use in their minds as a way to reinvest in the economy and make things better for everyone. Now, again, the reality is that doesn't happen. If you look at the 1920s, what happens is exactly what we've got now. The money all goes to the top. The rest of us are left way behind, and we inevitably reach a crisis, because you can't maintain an economy when 99% of people actually don't have enough money to keep a consumer economy going. But that's the ideology behind this movement conservative vision that Trump is in the process of putting in place. So where does this leave us? By the way, I'm really riffing here. I hope it's of use to you guys. I don't have notes in front of me today. I'm actually riveted on a new project, and was doing that right up until 1 o'clock here. So I'm kind of just riffing on the Republican project in the last 4 years. So where does this leave us? This leaves us with the recognition on the part of the Republicans, who are really the Trump party now. If you remember, they didn't even put together a platform this time around. They simply said they were going to support Donald Trump. It's the first time in history, to my knowledge, that a political party has not issued a platform. But what they have said is that they are simply going to do whatever Trump says, and that they recognize that he is not popular, and he is not popular. The most recent polling shows him 10 points down, which is huge in political land. And this is even while he is running a disinformation campaign with the help of the Russian government, which again, our intelligence agencies have ascertained, and they're jumping up and down yelling about it. And the Republicans in Congress are trying to look the other way, but there does not seem to be any doubt about that. So even with the help of the Russians, and with the disinformation of the Fox News campaign and One American News Network and 4chan and 8chan and all the things going, and QAnon, which is also very much a pro-Trump organization, even with all those things, he's still running 10 points behind. But so what are you going to do if that's the case? Well, first of all, you're going to convince your listeners and your adherents that Democratic victory is illegitimate, that Democrats themselves are illegitimate. They are, as QAnon suggests, attacking babies and drinking their blood, which again is an old trope in, I guess, probably all human history. I can only speak for America, but we've had it on these shores since the Salem witch trials, through the anti-Catholic riots of the 1840s, through actually an anti-political movement in the 1890s, through McCarthyism, and now into the present. So you're going to convince people that your opponents are inhuman, that they are destroying the country, and that they should not be allowed to vote. Even if they legally could vote, that it's actually an act of public service to keep them from voting. So rather than saying that throwing out ballots is undemocratic, as of course it is in reality, if you could step back and think about this, they are convincing their supporters that somehow people voting is itself illegitimate, that the idea that somebody is casting a ballot is dangerous, that Democrats voting means voter fraud, which is not true. That is, voter fraud is virtually non-existent, and that somehow if the Democrats win, as President Trump says, it will be an illegitimate victory. That itself is a fantasy. It is not real. It is the culmination of this imagery that the Republicans have been pushing since the Reagan years, and it's rooted in their ideology from the years immediately after the New Deal, when they came up with this modern idea of conservatism to push back against that liberal consensus. So first of all, you're going to convince, going into the 2020 election, your followers that somehow having Democratic voting is illegitimate. And that being the case, it is imperative then to stop Democrats from voting, to throw them off the rolls, to stop them from going into polling places, to getting rid of their votes, to cheating, to doing to making sure their ballots don't get delivered, to do anything to skew the election in your favor, because in their minds, that's the patriotic thing to do. And this, again, is the reason that I'm speaking about this as authoritatively as I hope I am, is because we've seen this before in America. This is precisely what the Democrats did in the American South during Reconstruction. They did not wake up in the morning one day and say, let's be undemocratic, let's throw African Americans off the votes. They woke up in the morning and said, let's be good citizens and throw African Americans off the voting rolls. And that's really what the Republican Party is doing right now, insisting that if Democrats are elected, it is going to be an illegitimate victory. And to that end, anything goes. If it means that you are going to make sure people don't vote, fine. If it means you're going to keep them from being able to turn in ballots, fine. And if it means you're going to try and fill a Supreme Court seat in order to make sure that the Supreme Court, the law of the land, will continue to shore up the Republican project, even if the vast majority of Americans turn against it, that's fine too. And of course, us packing the Supreme Court has been part of the Republican project since Ed Meese under the Attorney General under Ronald Reagan. So basically anything goes. What is most important is to get a Republican in office and to hold a Republican there. Because if, in fact, under their fantasy, their narrative, their image, a Democrat gets elected, it will, in fact, destroy America. But the truth, of course, is the opposite. What the Republicans have boxed themselves into is the destruction of American democracy. And what I mean by that is that, first of all, in order to have a functioning democracy, you have to have at least two parties that are considered legitimate, that can win an election freely and fairly, and that can then govern without being stopped by the other side. If you lose that, if you lose the ability for people who disagree with the government in power to have a say, if you lose their ability to back candidates that can speak for them, if they lose their ability to have a realistic expectation that their people could be in office on the next round, you have lost the legitimacy of a democratic government. So first of all, by getting rid of the idea that the Democrats could be legitimate, the current Republican Party is destroying the idea of a legitimate opposition. That also means that there will be no oversight of a second Trump administration, because the whole point of a legitimate opposition is to give a pathway for opponents of the current regime to go ahead and have a way to get into power, but also to oversee those people who are in power, to look at them closely and to say, hey, wait a minute, there's money coming out of here that shouldn't be. And perhaps you saw yesterday's report from Forbes, a conservative-leaning newspaper, that says that Donald Trump has pocketed more than $1.9 billion so far in his 3 years in office. That's something that should not be. It's unprecedented in American history, but he's getting away with it because right now the Republicans are not checking him. And a party would never check itself in power. Again, the same way that the Democrats did not check themselves in the American South in the late 19th century, because they were a one-party system, not a democracy, an oligarchy. So they're destroying American democracy that way, but of course they are also destroying American democracy by trying to make it so that people can't vote. If you make it so that only your own supporters vote, you are not a democracy. And crucially, if you are only looking at your own supporters, they are susceptible to becoming more and more and more extreme, because the way that you keep ginning up power amongst them is by convincing them they have someone to hate. And that's a really dangerous place we're in right now. The idea that they have to defend America, as Republican supporters have to defend America, by getting rid of Democrats, or by getting rid of people of color, or by getting rid of academics, close one to my heart, or by getting rid of activist women, because they, in this narrative, endanger true America. Those things are all terribly dangerous, and they mark a real, profound assault on American democracy. Where we are right now, and the question now for a lot of you is, will Trump give up? No, let me not end there. We are facing an extraordinary crisis in American democracy. We've never been here before. But I would like to leave this history of the Republican Party on a positive note. And remember, I am talking about the history of the Republican Party here, and not simply the history of America, although I seem to have veered into that in the last few minutes. And that is that there's a real problem, of course, with the way the Republicans have been acting. And there's a problem for the understanding of American politics, and that is that they have become so extremist, and they have become in such an echo chamber, and they have become such a danger to American government itself, that this cannot last. And people always ask me, what's going to happen in 2020? Here's a newsflash: I don't know. I do know that the current Republican Party as it is not sustainable. You cannot have a democracy in which the legitimacy of the government has come under question. And as I keep saying, it's one thing to have a glitch or two where, sometimes the Electoral College goes in a funky direction the way it did in 1888, for example, or in 1876. You can't have it when it's happened twice, and now we're looking at potentially a third time in American history, right in a row. The last two Republican presidents, but Trump, if he gets reelected, have not been reelected by a majority. They've been reelected in the Electoral College, and nobody is pretending that Trump is going to be elected by a majority. That's not even on the table. He is expecting to try and game the system and win in the Electoral College. That's not sustainable, because the people are simply not going to put up with a democracy where they don't believe that the country support, that the government is put in place by a majority. It's minority rule. That's not what a democracy is all about. So what will happen to the Republican Party in all this? Here's the way I game it out. First of all, the next several months are going to be rocky. This is not the first time in American history we have faced rocky periods. And I wish I had time to talk a little bit more about them, but I don't now. Even if Biden is cleanly elected immediately, it'll take a long time for Trump supporters to accept that they are no longer in control. But eventually, even if Trump does stay in power, at least temporarily, you guys game it out. Do you really see him making it another 4 years with this many people this unhappy? I don't. I don't see how that plays out, but I don't see it as a permanent Trump dynasty. I just don't. I mean, those people are old, or they're not very able people. So I really don't see that happening. What I do see, though, is something that for the Republican Party is a real problem. They have painted themselves into a corner. They're old and they're white, and they are fighting a reactionary holding action against the modern world. And that's not going to work. It never works. Every time we try and pull one of these reactionary coups, it might work in the short term, but the world is marching on. And unfortunately, thanks to Donald Trump, it appears the world right now is marching on without America. And I don't believe that Americans will put up with that. I believe that the current Republican Party is a reactionary party that will not survive, even if it manages to eke out some sort of a coup in 2020. It's not here for the long haul. And when I say not here for the long haul, I made the mistake last week of saying 20 years, 4 years, whatever, because I'm a historian. I'm talking 4 years tops, not 20 years. That really upset somebody, and it was just a number I threw out. So what's going to happen to the Republican Party? I do believe that ideology of the Republican Party that I started with all those months ago, that ideology of Abraham Lincoln, the idea that it is the role of the government to support innovators, people at the bottom, to have equality of opportunity and equal access to resources, will come back. That idea that if you put support for people at the bottom, they will produce more than they can consume, and things will rise upward. That idea is baked into our DNA since the Civil War, and I believe many people still continue to believe it. They do not believe in the oligarchy that Donald Trump now represents, and they certainly don't believe in the loss of democracy. So at the end of the day, I think the Republican Party, or perhaps not even under that name, but that ideology will come back. In the meantime, we're, as I say, at this crisis, but I want to leave you with this series on a positive note, and that is that I do what I do because I believe in democracy. I believe in self-determination, and I believe that this country belongs to us. And so I will leave this with Abraham Lincoln's warning that it is now up to us to make sure that this government remains a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thanks for coming along on this, and I'll see you in the future.